Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome you on behalf of Cornwall for Europe for what we hope is going to be the second of a number of talks from various people. On behalf of Cornwall for Europe, I'm very pleased and honoured to be able to introduce to you tonight the Right Honourable Dominic Grieve, KC. Dominic will, I'm sure, be familiar to many of you as one of the Remain Tory MPs sacked by Boris Johnson before the 2019 general election, but he also played a prominent role in the run-up to the referendum, having served as Attorney General from 2010 to 2014. After being called to the bar in 1980, Dominic was elected to Parliament as MP for Beaconsfield in 1997, and he occupied several shadow roles, including Shadow Home Secretary, Shadow Justice Secretary, and Shadow Attorney General, before being appointed to the Cabinet as Attorney General by David Cameron in 2010. Sacked in 2014, possibly because of his support for the ECHR, Dominic returned to the backbenches, where he served as chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, which produced the now notorious Russia report, publication of which was blocked by the government until well after the 2019 general election, and then only appeared in redacted form. Despite the fact that Ross Poldark always seemed to be galloping off to Westminster, Cornwall often feels a very long way away from the seat of power. So I'm sure that we're all looking forward very much to hearing Dominic's views on how we can build another relationship with Europe and possibly other current issues. Over to you, Dominic.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me an excuse to come to Cornwall, a county I know and love. I've always enjoyed coming here, although it's right to say that because of my French ancestry, the house I have is almost exactly 150 miles due south of here, at a place called Lanildut on the estuary of the Abbaye Ildut, which is a bit like the Fowl. It's a tiny little river running out westwards towards Ushant, which does mean that we usually get down to Plymouth very frequently because that's where we take the ferry to go across. But that doesn't mean to say that I don't also enjoy coming to Cornwall, which is actually in landscape terms is very, very lovely. Now, you've asked me to come down and talk about Europe, because that is the big topic, and I've noted the small elephant and the big elephant in the room, as we are holding a general election at which it appears to be an unmentionable topic, something which I will come back to in a moment. But the fact I'm in Cornwall, and the fact my house is in Brittany, and the fact that, in fact, the language spoken by my neighbours in Brittany just happens to be identical to that of those who belong to Cornish-speaking societies, is, I think, in itself rather a telling indicator that the idea that we live on a right tight little island which has no connection to what goes on the continent has historically been complete and total nonsense. We are culturally interdependent, and our history is entirely intertwined. And I find it therefore particularly extraordinary that as we're holding an election which appears to be quite important in respect to the future of our country, and one in which it looks as if there's going to be quite a seismic shift in electoral preferences, certainly for the foreseeable future, and in my view, wholly understandably, I may come back to that in a moment too, we're not discussing our relationship with our closest trading partners. And this really strikes me as being quite astonishing. So what I was going to do this evening was twofold. One, I just wanted to talk a bit about what I think the European Union and European unity is all about. I then want to just say a word about how we got ourselves in what I think is one of the most stupid messes that the United Kingdom has perpetrated on itself in its modern history, and say a few words about how we might get ourselves out of it, and what I think is going to be needed to bring that about. And when I've done that, I suspect I'll have spoken for about 20-25 minutes, and politicians or even former politicians, have a tendency to go on and on and on, so I shall curb it. And then at that point, we can have a conversation, which is often much more interesting than just listening to me. So, forgive me for just going back a little bit on some history. My late father was a Conservative to his fingertips, small c and big C, because he was also a Conservative MP. And I think he was brought up, his father, my grandfather, was killed during the First World War, but he was brought up in an atmosphere where UK exceptionalism and pride in empire and British power, even if it was waning, was very considerable. But his experience of the Second World War made him an absolute devotee of the United Kingdom going into the then EEC. And it was a generation, whether it was Ted Heath, whether it was Roy Jenkins, transcended and crossed political divides, where there were a large number of people who thought it was absolutely essential for the United Kingdom's well-being. And of course it was. Because at the end of the Second World War, the realization that Eastern Europe was falling under Soviet dominance, and the realization that actually, as imperial grandeur was shed by not just Britain but also France, the realization was there that in fact Europe's future depended on our cooperating together and above all making sure that we never had a recurrence of the sorts of conflicts that we had had in the previous 60 years. And that created the mass movement, which at its height meant that this organisation, the European movement, had, I think, 600,000 members. And it was also what brought people together on a cross-party basis, which is such an important issue, that it wasn't just Conservatives or Labour. In fact, both Conservatives and Labour Party were divided in the 60s on the issue, and the Liberals were mainly supportive. But it was the fact that the critical mass was achieved which enabled us eventually, after de Gaulle's repeated vetoes, which weren't particularly helpful, but enabled us, rather belatedly, to participate in the EEC. But that wasn't, of course, our only participation, because as was being hinted earlier, we'd also been founder members of the Council of Europe, which remains a very important organisation for bringing European countries together. And we were the principal creators of a remarkable document, the European Convention on Human Rights, which has done more to improve human rights throughout our continent in 60 years than almost anything else. Just worth remembering, sorts of things which we might now think quite bizarre, for example, discriminating against children on the grounds of their illegitimacy, very current in the 1950s, banned as a result of a case that was brought against Belgium. Just worth remembering how big the change has been. And all because these people saw the coming together of European countries and the pooling of ideas and the moderating of each other's thinking processes as being so enormously valuable. And on top of that, it proved to be economically valuable. And here, it is worth bearing in mind that the single market was Mrs. Thatcher's brainchild. She was the person who, born as the daughter of a grocer in Grantham, saw very clearly she had a huge distrust of large industry, which she thought was failing Britain, and she believed in SMEs, small and medium enterprises. And she considered that the greatest boost that there could possibly be to small and medium enterprises, cheese producers in Cornwall or whoever else it might be, was a single market, and she was absolutely and completely right. And quite apart from the fact that it turned the City of London and boosted it back to being the principal financial centre apart from New York, and even rivaling New York, and restored it as a leading world financial and financial services and related legal services centre, it also made an immense difference to increasing prosperity for every single person in this country. And we were and have been a positive influence in Europe, really valued. Just go and speak to the Irish, who are also still members of the EU, of course. But just speak to them about how much they valued British participation with them in Brussels. Or speak to all those Eastern European countries which were encouraged to join by Britain, who was their greatest advocate when the Soviet Union collapsed, and where the things that the United Kingdom offers by way of soft power, whether it's economically or in the way Brussels is run, because I should make clear, I think Brussels has many failings with the bureaucracy of the European Union. But for all that, we were seen as being a positive influence. And of course, coming back to what I said, our promotion of the European Convention on Human Rights, our promotion of standards about how states should behave towards their own citizens, absolutely key to our international status. Actually, the influence went beyond Europe. I kept on pointing out to Theresa May with Abu Qatada. I said, you've been getting very angry about Mr. Qatada and your inability to deport him to Jordan, but you finally succeeded. You succeeded because you persuaded the Jordanians to change the rules of their criminal justice system so it was acceptable to send him there. And that's what we did. That was the result of having observed the objections of the Strasbourg court to sending Qatada back to Jordan, because they said Jordan wasn't a place where he would have a fair trial, which was true. So he persuaded the Jordanians to change their criminal justice system as a consequence. All those things make me proud. And I enjoyed being in politics, and although I was by no means, as I say, uncritical of Brussels bureaucracy, it's always seemed to me that the positives of our participation in Europe at every level, be it the Council of Europe, the ECHR, or the EU, the balance sheet was entirely and completely positive. And then we threw it all away. Or we threw a large chunk of it away. And if I was still listening to people from my former party, of which I am no longer a member, even if philosophically conservative, some of them want to throw even further bits away as they seem to get angrier and angrier. No. I think we have to recognise, because I'm always very conscious when I come to European movement meetings, that most of us are pretty upset about what happened in 2016. And let's face it, I can read out the statistics, the consequences, as some of us said, have been entirely negative. Indeed, I can't think of a single positive thing that has come out of it, which is remarkable, because at the time I thought, well, perhaps the fisheries and various other things may turn out people will be happier with, but they're not. Nobody is happy. The farmers who voted for it aren't happy, because in fact they are SMEs and they have found that it is having a really bad impact on their ability to trade and to export. The impediments to trade are obvious. Every review that has come out shows that in fact the United Kingdom is poorer as a result of what we've done. There's going to be there's a 15% overall reduction in imports and exports, and a 4% reduction generally and in the long term on our GDP, which is an awful lot of money. It's about £2,000 per head. And all this for a fantasy. And of course some of the fantasies were we wouldn't have any immigration. Well, we now have much more immigration, and instead of having people who come in transiently to work and then they often go home, we have people, because they're coming from way outside and from other parts of the world, are in fact most unlikely to return. And so you're not even getting that synergy. And of course, we Britons are now being prevented from going and working in Europe, which was something which we were also doing a great deal of. So all that interconnectivity that was so valuable has gone. And as I was saying at the start of this talk, I find it astonishing. And here we are, we've got this election. It really is a very important election, and not one single party, not even the Liberal Democrats, really want to talk about the famous elephant in the room. it's there, and you're thinking about it, and I actually think this is a huge misjudgment, because they seem to have got it into their heads that people don't want to talk about it. Well, I'm not sure that's right. It's true that some people are embarrassed about talking about it, but at some point we are going to have to discuss it. Because if we don't, all we're going to do, and I'm old enough to remember the 1960s, is we are going to meander on and on and on, and some of you here are probably old enough to remember the 1960s, we're going to meander on and on and on as a failing economy, and I remember this all too well. And as in truth, what we really want in this country is a European model. By that I mean that I think we live in a country, and it's pretty clear to me, where people both want to be economically prosperous, but they also want a good level of public services, and they also want a cushion against things going wrong in their lives. Now, that's quite a challenging ask. It's very easy, if you want to adopt a United States model, to say, well, we can let the devil take the hindmost. We have very, very few measures to help the poorest in our society. But I see very little sign of that being the case anywhere in the United Kingdom. And of course, the extraordinary feature of Brexit was the coming together of two groups of people to promote it who had in fact completely opposite aims. On the one hand, some people who are so economically dry that they think the state should effectively cut itself back massively. And fairness to them, there is an economic model because they think that it will produce much more wealth further down the track, but nobody has really succeeded in doing it very well. And then, of course, there was another group who actually just wanted to pull up the drawbridge, have no immigration, and high levels of public services, which I'm afraid is a genuine fantasy. And those two groups are the two groups which produce the majority for Brexit. And my view is leave the first group to one side because they're never going to be reconcilable to anything. This is sort of Jacob Rees-Mogg view of the world. But the other group are the people who we are going to have to persuade that they made a mistake. You may call them the red wall seats, but they exist everywhere. And we're not going to do that by pointing the finger at them and saying you got it wrong. We will only succeed in doing it by persuading them that they shouldn't be embarrassed about accepting that there might be another, better way forward. Which is why, as we come to this election, I suspect the political parties have refused to engage on it, even though I think they are mistaken, because I think it could be discussed in terms that people would actually find interesting. And the risk is that by not discussing it now, we will just drift in the next 3 or 4 years, irrespective of who's elected. And let's face it, I think it's quite likely there's going to be a Labour government. I would be surprised if there were not. And the question then is, can they be motivated to do something about it? But we, as a movement, have therefore got an opportunity, but we've also got an enormous challenge. How can we do the job as a movement which will encourage people, and not just in one political party, because otherwise it won't work, in more than one political party, and the truth is you need the main party and the main opposition party, which will probably be Conservative, even that's a little bit hesitant. How do you persuade them, and enough of them, that there needs to be a rethink? And what sort of rethink should we be talking about? Now, I would love to be able to wave a magic wand and say, can I wake up to find it's the 23rd of June 2016? Or perhaps better still, to find it's the 25th, I think it is the date, isn't it? And that in fact we've won the referendum. But it's simply not possible. We can't simply turn the clock back. We can't and will never go back into the European Union on very advantageous terms that we had succeeded in negotiating for ourselves during our period of membership. I mean, I think people fail. When I think of the opprobrium Paul John Major had, and yet when you actually look at the negotiations he conducted in the early 90s, he secured for the United Kingdom essentially all the opt-ins or opt-outs, whichever you wish to discuss, which he saw as being economically beneficial to us, but still kept us at the heart of the European Union. And of course, if we were to go back now, then we would probably have to say that we would accept a single currency, which I'm not actually sure was the best thing the European Union ever did. I think, in fact, it generated some of the problems which precipitated the the depth of the financial crisis we had after 2008, and therefore helped fuel Brexit. And if we were to go back in, there would be no more UK opt-outs, so the terms of our membership would be quite difficult, and negotiating them would, I'm afraid, prove to be quite probably humbling, is the best way I can describe it. And it's all very well complaining about Spain and Gibraltar, but it is worth bearing in mind that when Spain asked to join the EU, if you remember, until then, the Spaniards were blockading Gibraltar. In fact, a very senior British diplomat was very quietly told to go to Madrid and to say, well, either you sort this out, or we're going to veto your membership. That, I'm afraid, is how diplomacy is conducted. And we've lost all that leverage. Indeed, internationally, we have been diminished because whilst we were in the European Union, we were seen by many countries outside as being key interlocutors within it. The United States undoubtedly saw us in that, but also much smaller countries. I was amused, or perhaps not entirely amused, to discover that the Caribbean states, which used to previously be British possessions, are all opening embassies in Dublin, where they never previously had any representation, because they find the Irish quite a good interlocutor to argue on their behalf in Brussels with the Commission on issues of trade. So how do we start rebuilding this? Well, I think the movement has got it right. We have got to do it bit by bit. And upset as we may be at what's happened, we have to look at this in the long term. And we also have to be mindful of the fact that the European Union itself is going through a period of very considerable challenge and change. We've just had the elections. Those elections for the EU Parliament show quite clearly that many of the problems we have here are reflected in exactly the same way in Europe and vice versa. We are living in a time of great uncertainty. I think public pessimism about the future of Western-style democracy, particularly European-style democracy, and look what's going on in the United States with Trump, which is truly terrifying. And people are angry and quite frightened. Frightened economically, frightened about the mass migration of people around our planet, frightened rightly, I think, about the rise of predatory states, be it China or Russia, and what that means after years when you could go to bed at night thinking, well, if Britain's not doing very well, at least we're part of an enormously successful group of countries. And I don't think that that can necessarily be said. And they're worried about things like climate change, which are all linked in. So, it seems to me we should be looking at a number of key things. One, there's some obvious ones. Is it really sensible that we should have restrictions? We shouldn't adhere to the same phytosanitary regulations as our European neighbours for the purposes of doing international trade deals which have so far delivered, according to the Office for Budget Responsibility, zero economic advantage to the United Kingdom, which it did not already possess when we were members. There is not going to be a trade deal with the United States. The trade deal with Australia is, in the words of Oliver Dowden, the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, probably not in our national interest, which is a pretty extraordinary admission. And without those, there is actually no reason why we shouldn't have phytosanitary alignment with the EU, which would enable those SMEs, particularly farmers, no longer to have their produce inspected when they go backwards and forwards, destroying lorry loads of goods, and it's going to get potentially worse this autumn. Secondly, whilst recognising that true and real freedom of movement can only come within the context of a single market, it ought to be possible to enable, and I don't really know why Labour didn't respond better when the offer was being made, but it may be repeated if they get into government, to enable young people to go and work abroad and young people to come here. It's the absolute building block. And I have to say, I feel ashamed when I go to address young audiences, because they think that what's been done by their elders is mad. And quite frankly, on the basis of everything that's happened in the last 4 years since we've left, they're absolutely spot on right. So they want to be able to go and get jobs. And frankly, welcoming young people from the continent is something which has been done, and I thought enriched this country enormously. And yes, 1 or 2 of them did stay. And actually, those who did have been economically highly competent. I live in a street in London where there are still lots of French people living who are actually no longer French. They've taken British citizenship a long time ago, and they've decided essentially to settle here. But they still maintain their connections. But a lot of them came over as young people to do it. So that, I think, is the second building block. Then we can certainly look, and I just get the hint that Keir Starmer is talking about doing this, but we can certainly see whether we can make sectoral agreements on the style that the Swiss have done. Although it's right to say the EU doesn't like the Swiss model because it's continuous negotiating. But there could be mutual advantage to doing it. And of course we should be doing more in sharing scientific research. And the other building block is international cooperation. Now, I don't know whether Liz Truss is going to keep her seat. I am actually going up to the only campaigning I'm doing at this election is the campaign for an independent called Mr. Bagg, who is standing to remove Liz Truss in South-West Norfolk. He's a conservative. And I said I would go, I'm going up next Wednesday to help him. I looked at what he had to say in his manifesto, and I noticed that above all, he'd been a member of her Conservative Association who had concluded when she was first elected that she was unlikely to do any good for her constituents. So, prescient. Anyway, my view, it's worth remembering that when we negotiated our departure, the fabled trade and cooperation agreement delivered by the Mr. Charlatan of all charlatans, Mr. Johnson, when he was offered by the EU, they said, "Oh, we would be really keen if you would participate in our Foreign Affairs Councils." After all, they're an area which falls absolutely outside the remit of the Court of Justice of the European Union in Luxembourg, so there's nothing about it being under the EU cosh. But we would value your participation. And Johnson refused. They were going to put it in the treaty. He refused to put it in. Then, of course, Russia invaded the Ukraine. And you may recall that Liz Truss was the Foreign Secretary at the time. And they invited her to go over to a meeting of the foreign ministers of the EU in response. And in fairness, she went. But when she was asked by a journalist as she came out, so after all that, you have attended a meeting of the foreign ministers of the European Union, she tried to deny it and to suggest that what she was really at was a meeting of the European foreign ministers of NATO, which was completely and totally false. But that's what she did. So of course we should be participating, because the evidence is overwhelming that this is going to be the big issue of the next decade. I don't wish to make you too depressed, very pessimistic about what is happening in the Ukraine. I think the threat to peace on our continent is at the worst point that it's been at since the late 1930s. And as war is disastrous, both in human loss terms but also economically, we ought to be working to make sure it doesn't happen. That probably needs spending more on defence, which is an uncomfortable topic, but it also means cooperating with the people who need to do the most heavy lifting to prevent this from happening. Because if we end up with a Trump presidency, we are in a really bad place. So that's the other element. And I think we will be welcomed. Now, looking more long-term, Europe's evolving. There are tensions within the EU. But if we position ourselves as a benevolent friend and get over all the problems of the divorce which came with it, which saw people on both sides behaving quite badly, I mean, apart from sending gunboats to Jersey, the cancellation of meetings by Macron, all this was a bit of a hissy fit. So we need to get beyond that. But the evidence is overwhelming. I mean, look at the way the French have welcomed the visit from the King. Our closest European partners want us to be involved. And the more we can deliver for them in terms of support, the more likely it is that some of the rougher edges of the trade deals and everything else with it can be slowly eroded and removed. And that's what we should be aiming to do. And this movement, I mean, remember, I don't know how long most of you have been members of the European movement, but it is, I have to say that in 2016, I think the membership was down to about 500, because there didn't seem to be any need, and I certainly wasn't a member. I mean, I perhaps blame myself. I think there's a lot of, as a liberal centre-right conservative, I'm afraid we didn't speak out anything like enough against our madder colleagues with their very bizarre views in the decade before the referendum in 2016. But leaving that to one side, there are opportunities for the movement, because the movement now has about 22,000 members. And frankly, it will soon have more members than the Conservative Party if it continues on its current trajectory. And therefore, there is a unique opportunity for us to do some good. But it will be done not by finger-pointing, as I said earlier, and above all, it will be done by embracing participation from people from all political parties. That's quite a challenge, because let's face it, on election night, a lot of you are going to be looking at the television. I won't speak entirely for myself, but you know, as those seats fall, you'll probably be opening a bottle of champagne. Because you'll think, well, they've got their just desserts, and you're probably entitled to do it. But it's also worth remembering that some of the people who are going to disappear, some of my former colleagues, are very pro-European. And I don't know who's going to survive out of all this, but it is necessary that they should be made welcome within this movement, because we know that we succeeded in creating, my first political act was to work for the Keep Britain in Europe campaign, so you can see how far back it goes with me. But we succeeded because it was a cross-party movement, and therefore overwhelmed those in all political parties who took a contrary view. Without it, just anchoring to one particular political party will never deliver the outcome we want. That's why it's so important we keep it as a cross-party organisation. But I think the opportunities are going to be there. I suspect Keir Starmer, if he becomes Prime Minister, is going to have to engage. As I say, I slightly regret he hasn't been bolder in being willing to admit it publicly, but it seems to me so obvious that it's going to happen that I am fairly confident that we will see movement. And once we see that, then the opportunities for us to press for a bit more will be there. And to build our own links, because one of the things I realise, you know, there's still a big Brussels office in London. I mean, bizarrely, I think there are more British diplomats now in Brussels than there were when we were members, which is an interesting reflection about power politics and where you have to be. So for all those reasons, there's a lot to talk about. And let's face it, Northern Ireland, it may have irritated Mr. Johnson, but it does provide a rather interesting illustration that the idea that we are disentangled from the European Union as a country is nonsense. And that actually curiously offers some opportunities as well as some challenges. So I think we should be quietly optimistic that we are turning a corner, and that there are opportunities for us that we can seize. And with that, I realise I have exhausted, probably gone over the time I said I was going to talk. And what I would encourage you to do now is to raise with me any topic that you want, including anything you think I may have tried to avoid, which is always a risk with politicians. I would like to thank you again for having invited me, but more than that, I would like to thank you for keeping that flag flying. Because there seemed to be a general expectation, and I saw it in my own constituency, that a referendum would happen, people would just vanish. We haven't vanished, we're growing. And I think that came as a bit of a shock to those who thought that somehow in politics this was going to be a determinative moment, and after that Europe and the EU and our participation and engagement with our European neighbours was somehow going to vanish. I'm afraid I don't know what they thought they were doing at school, but they had not read their history. Thank you very much. Yes?
Something that worries me is all of us in this room grew up with the EU. It's a default situation. We're 8 years on, we've got a generation of new voters coming in now. For the default situation for these new voters is that Britain is a third country, and it's with a very confusing political message. How do we engage with these new young voters to get convinced them how good life will be as Europeans?
You raise a very interesting point, because of course, well, we know two things about the referendum. We know that the young believed overwhelmingly that they couldn't understand what on earth the oldies were going on about in arguing that we would be better off out, and they couldn't see the point at all. Secondly, we know that unfortunately they didn't turn out in very substantial numbers compared to the oldies in order to go and vote. And thirdly, and I think you're absolutely right about this, that was the generation of 2016. You're in another 5 years, 10 years' time, there will be people who will be voting who were not even born when, well, yeah, 18, about 15 years' time, when never known what EU membership was about. And may therefore simply not understand what we're talking about, or even the earlier generation immediately above them is. My feeling is it's not against that, is that we live in a very mobile society. And the young do travel. They travel, they do school exchanges, they do all sorts of things. This city is twinned with Morlaix. I don't know if there are exchanges with schools. But they are going to pick up that the UK is on the fringe. And I have already difficulty. I went to do the Camino to Santiago to try and get politics out of my system. It was very good for me once lockdown had finished. But when I'd finished doing that, I couldn't go. I couldn't go to Europe for 3 months because I'd exhausted my 90 days in 6 months until time moved on. I did it in 2 chunks, but it was separated by only a few months between each one. It was over 9 weeks, nearly 9 weeks of walking. And so they will pick up that we are at a disadvantage, particularly over work. Because they will, their parents will say, oh, I went to work in ski chalets, and I went to do this, and I went to do that, and all that is gone. So my feeling is that there will be opportunities to push this message home. And the one thing I think which is noticeable, leave aside those who backed Brexit because they saw economic advantages from deregulation and were critical of the EU for being over-regulatory, which is all perfectly reasonable, but nevertheless I think they took to a conclusion which was false. But for the others, they are going to be in households which in truth must be concluding that Brexit has delivered nothing that they thought was going to be of value. And so for that reason, I think that as long as we continue to articulate that cooperation in a dangerous world is important, And the fact that, unless Europe goes completely off the rails in the next few years with extreme right-wing populism, the realisation will also be present that it is in fact our European neighbourhood, which is the place where people share the values that young people have. And I have yet to come across a young audience that gets worked up about our membership of the European Convention on Human Rights. Absolutely. Whereas, I'm afraid, I do have conservative audiences which seem to think that in some dark way it controls the country, which it plainly does not. So for all those reasons, I think there's a lot that we can do to make sure that young people see developing closer relations with Europe as being important to their well-being and that of their families.
Thank you.
Yes.
What do you think business can do to persuade politicians to engage in the questions and the opportunities?
Well, they should be constantly saying, I want to cut my costs. And the best way to cut my costs is by... It is bizarre. I talked earlier about the Rees-Moggs of this world wanting to deregulate, but in fact we've re-regulated. I mean, it's all this paperwork which is crippling business. And that's what you hear from everybody. So, and it's true, it probably doesn't affect very large businesses because they can do it all in block. But a small business, it's a disaster. You have to have the same form, you have to do repeat forms, and then your overheads go up. And let's face it, the difference between, anybody in here who's in business, the difference between profit and loss is often very, very small. Indeed, a good business is probably making quite small profits, unless its volume is such that it's hugely successful, because otherwise it's probably ripping off its customers. So, for those reasons, business should be making the case constantly. Local MPs, I don't know who your local MP will be in Truro in 2 weeks' time, but you will have a local MP, and your count will have been finished, and the colour of the area on the map may be significantly different from what it was before. You will have a local MP, and that local MP ought to be getting an earful from local businesses about what they think is needed in terms of enabling them to do more business or attract more business from the EU. And my experience is it works very effectively. If we do have a participatory and representative democracy in this country. For all the big national movements, nothing works better than turning up at your MP's surgery and saying, I'm not happy with this. It does work. And if enough people do it, and enough people are writing in, and it's not a round robin, obviously if it's one of those campaigns where everybody's sending the same letter, the MP starts to eyes glaze over. But I know from my time as an MP, if you got 20 letters from local businesses saying effectively the same thing in different ways, you woke up. Of course you passed it to the minister. So there are ways in which you can influence how government policy develops. And remember, one of the interesting advantages of this election, particularly after the strange disaster of 2019, is you're going to have an awful lot of MPs who are going to be very worried about keeping their seats at the next election. Because they will be quite surprised, some of them, that they're even representing particular constituencies. All the more reason for them to be uniquely responsive to what local business is saying to them. And for that reason, I think, in fact, there's quite a considerable opportunity. Yes?
I just wondered if you have some suggestions to counter people like the Jacob Rees-Moggers of this world about the loss of influence of Europe in this world. They're saying it's pivoting towards the east and we're a busted flush.
Jacob Rees-Mogg has a point. The last 200 years have been a very strange period in world history. For a very brief moment, a rather peripheral peninsula sticking out from the Asian continent called Europe, because of its governmental structures, and the way its citizens had the opportunity of developing ideas and wealth, got a technological edge which enabled it for a century to be almost completely globally dominant. And with the United States as effectively a massive colony, which then evolved into a mega-state, which has in a way been able to perpetuate it in a way which much smaller European states with 65 or even 80 million people are in no position to do, thank goodness. And when this came to an end, inevitably there was a period when, despite the fact it had ended, firstly because the United States remained super dominant, and secondly because the standard of living of European countries was so infinitely and remained so infinitely greater, and the trading links were still so advantageous, we had a period when, in a sense, we didn't notice. Even if Britain no longer had the biggest navy in the world and wasn't sending gunboats, and it had changed. In any case, our empire was always very odd because it was ultimately based on commercial interests rather than dominance of people. It just, we acquired the people as an afterthought. And that's gone. It's plainly gone, but there is nothing, and there is a challenge. And countries like China are large, authoritarian, rather nasty, and have developing wealth, although my own assessment as a historian is that a country which is as authoritarian as China may find it very difficult to sustain those sorts of levels of growth when it's so unresponsive to what its public want. China is, in a sense, a closed society in understanding some of the dynamics. There are riots on almost daily basis, we're told, in China. We just don't know about it, of people who are discontented with things that are happening and which are then suppressed. And China is an imperial power. It dominates Xinjiang and Tibet, and it's, in that sense, it's rather old-looking. There's no doubt that countries like Singapore have done remarkably well, but that's not unique. City-states, just like the Netherlands in the 17th century, this isn't unusual. But if I may say to Jacob, what I'd say to him is, so what? The United Kingdom is part of that peninsula, admittedly, a little offshore island off it. It's our neighbourhood, it's our backyard. And the idea that you can strike out on your own and ignore the fact that well over 50%, well, 50% of your trade is being done with your near neighbourhood is a fantasy. Now, I know that my former colleagues talked, only we can get this trade deal with the United States, it remains for historic reasons, which it does, our single biggest trading partner, 18%. But it's never going to happen. The United States is a highly protectionist, a continental power. The future lies in our interconnectivity with our near abroad, and of course from that you can also, if we were to play our cards right, I am fairly confident that the future of Europe is bright. Climatically, it's fairly good. At a time when some parts of the world are becoming uninhabitable, I think the threat of social upheaval through mass migration is a real phenomenon. I don't think it can be ignored, and that is why the Reform Party is doing well. It's absolute basic fear. And but the idea that we can tackle that on our own is nonsense. You can see, unless we want to turn into North Korea and send a gunboat to machine gun these unhappy people on their rubber dinghies in the channel, they are going to arrive.
I did ask somebody saying that they wanted to do that.
Yeah, well, yes, well, people can have different viewpoints, but I regret to say I think there are some people, but I hesitate to introduce religion into this, although I see the cross at the back. But the United Kingdom, even if it's lots of people say they're secular, is mercifully, as is most Western Europe, suffused with some Judeo-Christian ethical principles, including not killing people who are asking for sanctuary. So that's where the bottom line for me is, and I suspect for the vast majority of people in this country. So, for those reasons, we have got to make our near abroad work. Because you can't cut itself. ourselves off from it. And if indeed the critique, after all, it was Angela Merkel who famously made the critique. She said it's all very well, but Western Europe is the place which it may produce quite a lot of the world's wealth, but it also spends more on welfare than anywhere else. And this disproportion is hard to maintain, and people have become used to it. But that's not to say that it's a wrong aim, but it is to say that you have to be realistic and about the balance. And one of the critiques I have of Labour's economic policy, and I hesitate to say it, is that Keir appears to be talking rather grandly about, and for understandable reasons, about saying that non-wage benefits ought to rise for working people. Which, of course, is the opposite to what Jacob Rees-Mogg would talk about. But, of course, if you're not in the single market, you don't have a level playing field. Because actually, the single market insisted on essentially a level playing field for non-wage benefits for working people. So if we have the same level of benefits as a country like France, but we also have much bigger trading costs, we will not be able to deliver on any of it. That's why I think the near abroad really matters, because it is how we collectively, as Europeans, craft our future, which will ultimately determine, to my mind, how prosperous and what the quality of life, it's not just about prosperity, it's what the quality of life is for people in this country. And, you know, before we get too depressed, the quality of life in this country remains pretty good. I wouldn't change this place for anywhere on planet Earth, despite all my critiques and criticisms and irritations. And I live in a big city in London, which is remarkably safe, and I've lived in all my life, know my neighbourhood. I think how blessed and lucky I am. And of course you come down here and you've got a much nicer climate, none of that humidity and heat today, and I think to myself, and it's a very beautiful place. So, that's what we should be doing, and that's the answer to Jacob Rees-Mogg. It is the idea that you can somehow isolate yourself from these failing Europeans and create something entirely different, which means that we're part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and suddenly we are the Singapore of the North East Atlantic, I think is entirely unachievable. Who else? We've got a bit longer. Hilda? Yes?
I'd like to share your faith, a little bit of faith you had in Keir Starmer, but I had a really unpleasant visit from Ed Miliband at my doorstep about 10 days ago, and we had a blazing row on the doorstep because I heard downstairs, I knew it to be a political party, I was waiting for Labour, and
you had
I
Ed?
couldn't believe I had him. So fantastic. Let's talk about Brexit, Ed. No, and the conversation continued. He flew at me, and he told me I was very rude, that I should not roll my eyes at him. And did I not know that that was a very rude thing to do? Because he said, well, come on then, what are you offering? And he said, well, GB Energy. I said, I want to talk about Brexit. And he really lost his cool completely.
Very rude of him. If I see him, I mean, I do see some of my former colleagues, including Labour colleagues, from time to time. I haven't seen Ed for a while. I'll tell him. What's the point?
My partner had gone to the door with his Make Votes Matter poster, and then I sort of come down from my mother's room. I just thought, God, this is my moment. Horrible day at Trellis. It didn't help when I said, oh, I work at Trellis, and we had a lot of trouble over Brexit in our department. The Polish receptionist ended up in tears and all this sort of thing. And he didn't know that she had to whisper to him, that's the local hospital. Why send him when a lot of people on the doorstep wanted to speak about the NHS? He was extraordinary and not content with that. So he said, we're not talking about Brexit. He said, we're not going to change it. And she said, oh, the only thing she said, she was hiding behind him. She's our candidate, she was hiding. And she said, oh, change is what we're offering. I said, you're not offering any change. I said, you are...
There is, I'm afraid,
there's just nothing.
I found this election, I have to be careful. 4 years ago I was in Parliament, and it may be that being thrown out of my party by Johnson and then leaving the House of Commons has somehow changed my mindset. And of course I'm a barrister, and so I have been used over the years to cutting through rubbish. But there is something uniquely depressing about this election in terms of the quality or lack of quality of debate. Leave aside rejoining the EU. In a sense, the real elephant is all these people are going around saying, we're going to make you more prosperous and we've got money that we're going to spend. And the answer is, well, where's this coming from? None of them say they're going to raise any taxes. Very nice, actually, as a taxpayer. I'm very grateful for that. But where is the money coming from? Because unless it comes from economic growth, and you can obviously, if you have economic growth, you're going to have more in the kitty, even if you don't raise taxes. But as the UK's economic growth has been sluggish, flatlining, and whilst I accept some of that is of course due to COVID and the Ukraine, that's true, but anybody who looks at the comparators with our European partners can see that, relatively speaking, they have done better over the last 5-6 years than we have. I know there are ups and there are downs, and one's got to be a bit careful, but we are not performing well. And above all, we've got rather low expectations. Because in 2016, I know there's a lot of criticism of the austerity policies of Osborne and Cameron, the coalition government, but in fairness, the coalition government never thought that it was going to deliver austerity for 15 years. The idea by early 2016 was that the UK's economy was doing better than anywhere else within the EU, which it was, in the 6 months leading up to the referendum, and then it went down. Slowly, not immediately, but it just started to flatline. And we do not have an answer to that. And so, I realise Labour will win, partly because, frankly, the government has been a disaster. Quite apart from the fact that economic competence has not been good, the previous hallmark, Conservatives tended to pride themselves on the idea that they at least delivered government with a high level of integrity, and we have had a charlatan Prime Minister followed by a nutcase. It really isn't a good look. So, I feel sorry for Rishi Sunak, because on the face of it, it's impossible to turn round. And so Labour will win. But we haven't had an election at which there has been a debate on what is the best way to craft the future of our country. What are the things that we should sensibly be doing to bring that about? Anybody who's watched those debates can see that there is absolutely none of it. It's not just about the EU. It's actually about anything. And I do find that quite worrying. Now, other people will say to me, well, hasn't it always been like that? And yes, let's face it, elections often have a huge amount of froth. But when the situation is quite as challenging as it is at the moment, it would be jolly nice if politicians were to open up, if only to say, and this is the thing I don't understand, but maybe I'm wrong, I actually think a bit more honesty might go down incredibly well with the electorate. If people actually started saying, well, I don't have an answer to that. We will feel our way on this, but I can't give you the promise on this, because I don't know. We're hopeful that if we do this, it will lead to that, but it won't necessarily do so. We might have to think of something else. I think people might become quite engaged. And at the end of the day, I'm afraid there's a sort of terrible symbiosis here. Governments end up with the electorates they deserve, and electorates end up with the governments they deserve. And I am worried. If you really want my view, I think this election has been uniquely depressing in that context. And I'm afraid, by the sounds of it, Ed Miliband has added to my sense of depression from having heard about his visit down here.
Unfortunately, we didn't have one of those doorbells, because I would have had it on the news that night, because it was so extraordinary. To behave like that on the doorstep was unbelievable.
Yes?
I feel I'm going to declare myself, so I'm the Liberal Democrat candidate.
I'm delighted to meet you.
For those of you that don't know me. And I would probably agree with you to some extent around the broader discussion that is happening in this election, but certainly on the specific question of Brexit, I don't think I've received a single email about it.
No.
It's not something that people broadly. I haven't knocked on your door yet.
No, I've written constantly. I'm constantly.
Yes?
It hasn't been something that been raising on the doorstep. And the thing that is the most consistent thing that I hear from people is just that they feel very disenchanted, disillusioned.
Yes.
There is a complete lack of confidence or trust in
Yes.
politics and politicians' ability, frankly, to do anything particularly useful. And I suppose I feel that, you know, I want us to be back in Europe. My party wants us to be back in Europe. But I do feel that the kind of state that we're in at the moment as a country, we need to get our house in order first for that to be, you know, something that we can pursue. And so I stood in 2019 as well, and that was such a sort of divided and divisive time. I do feel like, you know, we need to, like you say, tread carefully with it.
You have my sympathy. I mean, I have been involved in politics long enough to know that, you know, on the whole, if you go to an audience and they don't raise a topic which you think is quite a difficult topic, you don't normally volunteer it. But it is worth bearing this in mind. I'm going to simply say this. You're absolutely right. The disenchantment levels are enormous. When I started out in politics, people had a healthy, cynical view of us as politicians, it seemed to me, which was that we were genuine people who came out and made promises, and then circumstances made it difficult to fulfil them. That's quite healthy. Nowadays, they think we're a bunch of liars. So we're going out deliberately to say anything we like, even though we know very well that it is undeliverable, so we don't believe in it ourselves. And of course, they are looking at, really since 2008, for many static earnings in terms of their purchasing power, and therefore their quality of life reduced. Of course, it doesn't apply right across the board. Some people have done very well indeed. Others, large numbers, haven't. So of course they're disenchanted. And they will communicate that. I picked it up myself. But the difficulty is, you want to be elected, therefore you're going to make sounds about being sympathetic to the disenchantment and coming up with ideas. And I've recently presided over a cross-party, had David Howarth on it, and Margaret Hodge, and some retired civil servants on standards and ethics in government. So focusing on one specific thing, which is frankly the scandal that standards in government of government behaviour have absolutely crashed. I mean, it's largely due to Johnson. But in fairness, actually, some of it goes back a long way back. Blair and even Brown are not blameless on some of these aspects. And suggesting ways in which it could be easily remedied. And I think Keir Starmer is probably going to adopt it. The Liberals have adopted it. I spoke to Ed Davey about it. He seems very enthusiastic. So I was very pleased. I have to say, I did also send an advance copy to number 10 Downing Street and didn't even get an acknowledgement, but that may just be incompetence. And we had some good people on this commission. So yes, that's important, but equally, and I realise this is a big ask, this is an election for 4 or 5 weeks. People who otherwise just want to get on with their lives, why do they want to elect us as politicians? They elect us as politicians because they think that we have a degree, we're willing to devote ourselves to doing something that they don't have time to do. There's no reason why they should be focused for them all the time on politics. The politicians we sent to Westminster are people who are supposed to be professional, which is why I think so angry about my former Conservative colleagues who professionals have been so stupid. They should never have elected Boris Johnson. They knew he was a con man. They were desperate, so they went for him. But if we don't, in the course of a general election, this is where I've shifted my ground now that I'm no longer in party politics, if we don't have to take that opportunity to discuss really big issues, and we soft-soap the electorate too much, then because we don't talk about Brexit because they don't want to talk about it, even though we know that it is the elephant. It's not the risk that they're going to be disappointed very quickly. And that, I think, is the anxiety, because ultimately participatory parliamentary Western-style democracy is dependent on people having confidence in it. And if they don't, then you start seeing what happens in Hungary or anywhere else, where they start saying, well, I think I should have a strong man, you know, who will, or strong woman, I don't think it really matters one way or the other, who will be authoritarian. And, you know, astonishingly, Mr. Farage seems to think Mr. Putin has virtues, whereas I find it very difficult to see that he has anything except vices. But it's quite an allure, you see. And so I do regret that we are not talking, just because it offends the comfort zone of the electorate, isn't a reason why it must not be talked about. But I do accept that in reality, for a politician seeking election to go and deliberately stir up the people on the doorstep by raising a topic they would prefer to ignore because it's there, but they don't want to talk about it, that's quite hard. What's the old 16th century thing? As I was going up the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I do so wish he'd go away. And that, I'm afraid, is a lot of what politics is all about. Did I see another hand up? I thought, oh, I see two, three, sorry, seven.
Can I ask you to look at your crystal ball, the future? Given where the Tory party is now, very rapidly anti-European, what do you think the chances are in the election? Is it going to move, or is it just going to be reform that takes advantage then?
Well,
that seems to be the case.
I'm fine predicting, apart from the fact that my best prediction, because I've been saying it for a lot longer than the current opinion polls, but my sense even a year ago, I was saying I think the Conservative Party is going to be filleted because there's a massive withdrawal of support. I was elected in 1997 when one of 162 Conservative MPs, and it was the worst result the party had had since 1906. And I thought then, and nothing has happened since to change my mind, that the outcome is likely to be worse. Now, I don't know whether it's 120 or 100, or even 80, although if you go below then it starts to put in some other things. So we're going to get a thumping Labour majority. I don't know how many seats the Liberal Democrats will win. I hesitate to say this in the presence of your candidate, but the Liberal Democrats have, I think, chosen to fight this election on the basis of there being 50 by-elections, and they're going to really pile in for that and try to win those seats. But the trouble is, if you win 50 seats, it's great. You will be the third party in Parliament, which means that you will get airtime, which at the moment they're deprived of because the SNP have it. But there's a little bit of me, I hesitate to say this, that if the approach of the Liberal Democrats in the last 2 years had been to do a really clear ideological pitch further to the right of where they market themselves, I think they had the potential of this election to actually replace the Conservatives as the second party. But I don't think they have chosen to do that for reasons which I can understand, and in any case, it might be unacceptable to some of their core supporters. But that's my own assessment looking at my own constituency, where I had Liberal Democrat support when I stood as an independent in 2019, for which I was immensely grateful. And indeed, my director of campaigns, my deputy director of campaigns as an independent in 2019 is now the Liberal Democrat member of Parliament for Chesham and Amersham, the adjoining constituency, which she won, I think, largely on, well, she got selected largely on the back of the network of links that she was able to establish, and she's a very good local MP, and I hope will hold her seat. What's going to happen to the Conservative Party? Now, oddly enough, I was travelling on a train with Michael Crick, who some of you may know is a journalist, and I was sort of saying, well, he was saying, you know, he's a man who ferrets around in all the sort of morass of statistics, an investigative journalist, and he said, you know, my view is that if the Conservatives go down to 120 or 100 seats, actually there will be a majority of One Nation Tories in the parliamentary party. Well, I didn't know that because it's all very complicated, and on the whole, the party has shifted at parliamentary level more to the right, and of course they took the thing over bluntly after 2016, and the ERG, as it was called, completely dominated and forced Theresa May into directions which led to my rebellions, which is why at the end of the day I got chucked out, along with David and others. So that's quite interesting, but of course as long as the membership have responsibility for electing the leader, even if the parliamentary party chooses the final two candidates, then on the basis of what I've seen of my own association, I think the party, the membership, just as it did with Momentum and Labour, has moved to the left. I think the party has moved to the right. So my concern is that in fact we get a link-up between sort of the Suella Bravermans and Priti Patels of this world and Mr Farage. And that the party reproduces itself as a sort of AFD, UK-style AFD. Now, one would hope that if that were to happen, the Liberal Democrats might then finally see that there is a void to be filled, but not an easy one for them, and do something about it. But the risk is that if Labour fail, then I can easily see, and this is what Farage is aiming, this is what Farage thinks is going to happen, that by 2029 there will be a right-wing, really right-wing conservative stroke reform alternative which will be threatening, and people will be so angry and so upset that they will do what appears to be likely to happen in France in the next 3 weeks, which is to vote for a party, a really right-wing party. But maybe that won't happen. Maybe the Conservatives will pull back to the centre, which is what they have tended to do. And we've never had a lurch to the right in the Conservative Party like this before. The Conservative Party has always had a right-wing element in it, but on the whole it's always been kept under control. And because we have first past the post, which is not likely to change with a big Labour majority, I'm afraid, even though I am a believer in proportional representation, ultimately the two main political parties in this country have always been broad and included elements which are a bit fringe, particularly on their right and left, but have tended to neutralise them. The disaster that's overtaken the Conservative Party from my point of view is that the wacky fringe took it over, helped by a shift in opinion of the membership and a failure by people like myself. I mean, I have to acknowledge, I think we all carry a degree of blame to see the extent to which it was happening and to argue and fight against it. Just to sort of take a default view that it just had to be managed. And Labour's had the same problem with Corbyn, but it's come back from it, so the Conservatives may do likewise. Or we may have a complete political realignment. I just don't know. What I do know is I'm obviously, if it's going in the Priti Patel direction, I'm never going to be a member of the Conservative Party again. Was there anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, can I just pick up on your earlier comments about reaching across the divide to people who, there's a certain element of Brexiteers who you were saying that there was potential there. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on a little bit more detail about some of the strategies you use, because I think for a significant proportion of Remainers there are some hurdles such as grief, trauma and various other things. And for a significant hurdle for those Brexiteers are overcoming dissonance.
Yes.
And so I think in order to reach a discourse which is acceptable for both parties, I really think that there needs to be some kind of dialogue. It will need a change of tone, and it will need enormous courage from both sides to establish things like forgiveness, realisation, and all those human qualities which are difficult and delicate. Now, in the face of that, I'm getting to the point, I think the hurdles, I mean, those things are very, very delicate, and the hurdles we face are the rage farmers of the populist movement. I'm not going to mention any names, so I don't think they deserve a mention, but the problem that we've got is that it can be trashed by the manufacture of fear and hatred. And I'm wondering how on earth we're going to do this.
Well, I agree with everything you've just said. My nuclear family, I think we were all in agreement about the undesirability of Brexit. I'm sure we were. But looking at my wider family, I have members of my wider family who voted leave. And they didn't do it for dishonourable reasons. They did it because they actually thought it was in the national interest. I think they misunderstood the way the EU worked. I think they may have misunderstood the consequences, although, on the whole, when I talk to them nowadays, we try to avoid this subject a little bit, they would say it was a sovereignty issue, and that mattered to them. And we have to understand that people feel very threatened in their identity at the moment for reasons that we've discussed over immigration and generally. We are in a world of identity politics, and I'm afraid there's a long history of mainstream political parties simply ignoring this, or indeed just deceiving their electorate about the consequences of globalisation. It's very, very difficult issues, and I think they're paying a big price for that. Equally, I think that many of the people who voted leave do realise that it has not delivered what they wanted. It either hasn't changed things which bothered them, or it's made things worse. Farmers are a classic example of this, because many of them did vote to go. And I remember realising we're going to lose the referendum when I came down to do a talk about the British Constitution at Clovelly on the 15th of May 2016. I gave a lecture, and afterwards there was a wonderful dinner attended by large landowners, local businessmen, and some retired diplomats. And apart from the retired diplomats, everybody was voting leave. Absolutely everybody, and I thought, that's it. I mean, this isn't a group of ignorant people. This is a group of people who actually have been doing some thinking and have come to this conclusion that this is the right thing to do. And although I thought they were wrong, one has to recognise that people do have reasoning power, and they will have done it for what they thought were valid reasons. So yes, I agree with you entirely. It's why there's a real problem. I think actually the problem is easing off. But in the immediate aftermath of Brexit, a lot of members of this movement were, people who like going out wearing berets with stars on top. Actually, we've discussed this with the chair of this movement, but opinion polling showed how, mass demonstrations by people I went on all the big marches actually don't really have any positive impact at all. And I do think there has to be a healing process. And if people are going to change their mind, it has got to be done, as I think I said earlier, without them feeling humiliated that they have. So it's got to be a process of change. After all, most of us in the course of our lives have changed our opinions on things. And so it happens gradually, and then it happens naturally, so you don't feel, having done so, that you are making an admission of failure. Which was why I think it's so important that our campaigning should be, and to this extent I understand why Keir Starmer and Ed Davey and even Rishi Sunak have not gone out to talk about the benefits or otherwise of Brexit, because of this sort of taboo element. But if you go out and say, look, forget a moment about EU membership, but wouldn't it make sense if our young people could travel more easily and get jobs? And I think my feeling is that if an incoming government, a Labour government, starts doing this, I have a sense that except for one or two ideologically driven individuals for whom this was all part of a sort of package, I think most people say, oh, that's good, let's accept it. It will only start to create problems if you're coming back to these identity issues. But I've always felt that on the identity front, the tragedy is that Brexit hasn't resolved it. On the contrary, identity politics and fear of identity loss has become a very much bigger issue even than it was 8 years ago. Something like, yes.
Yeah, my question was, after the referendum, it was a very close result, and there was then, you were involved in the efforts to have a new referendum and to reverse the result. I just wondered, with hindsight, whether that was whether efforts might have been better spent actually to push for to accept the result and to push for a closer relationship with Europe than the one we ended up with.
I used to lie in bed at night worrying about this, and I thought about it over and over again between 2016 and 2019. Because you're right, and I kept on saying, you must not do this because you're angry. What is it that you're going to do next? And in the initial stages, post-2016, I went along with it, in the sense that I thought this was a very bad thing. I worried, I thought, what's public opinion going to do over the next 3 years? It's got this 2-year negotiating process. How are we going to cope with this? What happens if public opinion shifts markedly? Which actually it didn't do very much, but it was possible. And I confined myself to standing up and saying to Theresa, asking questions as a backbencher in the House, saying, please don't close down options. But you see, the trouble was that at a very early stage, she came under so much pressure from the ERG that although her own instincts were to deliver what we would call a soft Brexit, she was constantly being pushed by them, and it was a very strange process because on the one hand, she would get all this inflammatory rhetoric. There was her party conference speech in 16, Citizens of Nowhere, which actually made me very, very angry. There was, and then there were her Lancaster House speeches, and a special, crafted, bespoke relationship. And there was one she did in Florence. At the same time, she was trying to evade them, and I knew this, trying to evade the ERG by actually putting together a soft Brexit package. Although nothing like as soft as it might have been, when you think people like Daniel Hannan were talking about having a Norway relationship before the referendum, and then within 12 months sort of totally abandoned it. So she was being pushed. And the more she was being pushed, the more I and the group, I suppose, who I sort of connected with, but all in differing degrees, got more and more alarmed by what was happening. Because as the Labour Party, the truth is I don't think Corbyn believed in the EU at all, he believed in revolution. And as the Labour Party showed itself, well, A, she never reached out to the Labour Party. She didn't reach out to the Labour Party because Theresa was in many ways an admirable person, and she was a friend of mine at university, I've known her for years, but she was a party person. So the idea she'd ever do something which didn't go down well with her association in Maidenhead, the idea that she would reach out and get Labour Party support to face down her own right-wingers in the ERG, inconceivable. And that meant that the ERG had a complete veto, and ultimately, because they didn't like the deal that she put forward, which was actually still pretty hard, but it was a softer Brexit than we'd otherwise have got, they destroyed it. And I had to make a decision at the end, because my rebellions were over process. They weren't over the main issue until the very end. I rebelled because we had a crazy system we were introducing, which enabled us potentially to come out of the EU without having even primary legislation on what the future terms of our membership would be. And it was partly shadow boxing, I have to accept as well, but at the very end there was an issue. Should I support her deal when it came to the House of Commons in December 2018? And I found that very difficult, because I didn't like the deal, and by then I'd come to the conclusion that although I thought a second referendum was a high-risk strategy, and indeed might simply have repeated the result of the first, I was so worried about where we were going that I thought it was worth the attempt. And had I thought that by voting for her deal, the deal would have passed, I would have voted differently. But the arithmetic was absolutely clear on all three votes. The first one she lost by 215, whatever it was, and it was a huge rebellion. The second one by a little less, but the third one, there were still 38 Conservative rebels, which was, of whom only 6 were, of my way of thinking, saying second referendum, we won't support this. And actually I offered to help her at the very end. I persuaded her about 4 days before she resigned that if she were to allow for a vote for a second referendum, I would vote for her revised deal. This was in May, but she was gone 48 hours later. She finally agreed to allow, she was trying to prevent a vote taking place on this. So, maybe I was wrong. I don't know. I mean, but I don't think a decision by me or the others, you know, Anna Soubry, Philip Lee, who went to the Liberal Democrats, you know, all those, I don't think it would have made any difference. The truth is, there was a group who wanted hard Brexit, and they were in a position to defeat the government over and over again because Labour were not prepared to do anything. A small number of Labour MPs who were prepared to support, who were pro-Brexit, who were prepared to support the Conservative government. But it was never going to be enough. So I don't think it would have made any difference. And I know there's always a lot of talk when you read all these wonderful learned academic things saying, you know, we could have had a soft Brexit if more people had supported it. Yes, we could. But they weren't there. So it was never going to happen.
Well, I'd like to thank Dominic very much on behalf of everybody for his fascinating talk. It could carry until midnight. Yeah. Unfortunately,
It's been a pleasure.
That isn't a possibility. There is tea and coffee at the back, and I'm sure people would love to continue this conversation with you for a short while you're socialising at the back. So thank you very much.